as well is that there's also a great movement within America to restore and renew Tatanka, bison, or the American buffalo. And so this past year, I've been asked to speak on the role of climate change and buffalo restoration renewal as a positive aspect going forward, and how we look at, again, the buffalo as a major focus point of how we restore the land and restore our cultures, strengthen the land, strengthen our cultures. So there's a major effort going forward to develop a continental scale reintroduction here in America, and that's working with the First Nations in Canada as well. Cultural heritage, I know that's a UN term. I'm sort of rallying around that. I'm beginning to practice that more in terms of how we talk about our languages, our lands, our customs, our places. And so cultural heritage has been a unifying theme for me as I think about how we work with climate change, how we work with adaptation, and how we really develop an agenda going forward. Well, we know that there's a 2030 agenda. There's been this great effort around the United Nations to chart a path forward. Well, we also have a path forward as Indigenous people, and I think we need to be mindful of that Indigenous people, live, have sustained a livelihood on, they say, 80% of the biodiversity in the world. So there's an important factor here. There's important aspects of this work that we always have to be mindful that Indigenous people are still here, and we also make a contribution to the world in terms of the spiritual side of these things. And so I think it's good that we have these kind of conversations. It's good that we can use these kind of platforms like technology to share these things, but also we got to know that there's inequities in our world around Indigenous people and our issues. So so we need to keep working at it. And I think these efforts like these webinars give us an opportunity to talk about it, but also to take action. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, James. I think that's extremely important, and I'm glad you brought up the youthful component of it. I have a new girlfriend. I told my wife it's all over. From now on, Greta is the gal in my, and of course I started school in Denmark, so I have a great affinity for the Scandinavian mindset. So on our same question then, Melanie, would you like to share with us your thoughts?
Thank you. Let me, I feel like we keep going in a cycle of a lot of alignment, a lot of great energy. And I think it's really sad to see that, again, where we're coming into an economic crisis, a lot of the great energy and movements to change the systems are not able to sustain themselves. So we have a movement building, kind of coalitions. I'm thinking back to 2008. There's a lot of great energy, and I'm coming back to the United States and mobilization, and how much work goes into gaining momentum, mobilizing, changing policy. Back in the 70s, I hear a lot of my mentors. I was living with Jan Black, who is a professor from the Monterey Institute this fall. And, she was saying, we had it all figured out, in the 60s and the 70s. And then there's all of this incredible progress that just gets backrolled. And, look at where we are now. So we're in a kind of comical, crazy crisis at this point. It's almost, it's so surreal. And I feel like COVID is sort of punctuating that. But to go back from before that, and as I said in the introduction, I think we've really, we're continuously moving further towards the cliff. And this, it is so tragic. I'm so sad about the human costs and the economic costs of life, and especially the vulnerable people who are already vulnerable to climate change across Africa and India, and so many of our people in our network. But we were really, really off track. And so my prayer is that, wow, if we could experience this connection with each other to gain more empathy and to really, really, really wake up, that we really, really, really need to change the system. I pray that the large organizations, the movements, the donors, the people who say that they want change, can we find a way to create affinity groups across these SDGs? This is what was not working. So I have a lot to say on this, but it was really the way that we are creating change has been very ineffective. It has been dependent on funding from certain power structures, which are not aligned with changes. And so I think we need to kind of go back to Martin Luther King, Gandhi, like what does it really take, and go balls out. So yeah, it wasn't working. We need a system change. And I'm really inspired by the work that was done at Standing Rock. And I think that we need to bring that momentum and amazing, 300 nations of indigenous people across the Americas united together. The world needs to know about that. And we as a human family now need to amplify and multiply that spirit globally as indigenous people of this planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. One human family is exactly right. I think and waking up is exactly right. I think the idea of progress and concerns about that will lead nicely to listen to Richard's comment, because when Richard started working in the environmental field, the rivers were burning in Ohio. And when your rivers are burning, even a jaded capitalist will indicate that something's wrong. And so it takes a wake-up call. And yes, we can be hopeful, even though I don't believe any of us are Pollyannas, but to build on that. And I would say that the economics have pulled out the rug for some people, and we don't think we're getting ahead. My statement, that my bromide, is that if money is your greatest impediment, then you've got a problem, because usually it's imagination. And that's what we want to build on, the creative imagination of 7.6 billion people. That's a tremendous resource. So, Richard, would you like to share with your thoughts?
Well, thank you. I'll save the positives for the end, and really I am quite hopeful. But in the limited time I have now, just to start, I want to mention the negatives. It was really in 1896 that the Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius identified global warming. And in 1979, US government scientists were predicting this is going to be a really big problem. And since then, more than 40 years have been squandered. And now we're facing not just an ecological, but an existential apocalypse coming clearly into sight. And I want to make just two frightful points. The first point is that before COVID-19, and indeed for many centuries, humanity has been causing what is now the sixth extinction in the last 500 million years since life has been on Earth. You can read Elizabeth Colbert's excellent book, The Sixth Extinction, and the most invasive species, which of course is us, is displacing and killing off many other species. And the climate scientists are telling us that on our present rate of putting fossil fuel chemicals, mainly CO2, but there are others, into the air, in about 200 years, we're facing human extinction, and we'll join in the sixth extinction ourselves. And we can talk about the dynamics of that, but I don't want to take up too much time. But we're about 200 years away from human extinction if we continue business as usual. The second point I want to make is that catastrophic ocean flooding is now inevitable. You might say, this is a bad pun, you might say baked in, and many responsible scientists say that it's already too late to prevent vast coastal areas from going into the sea. And again, this prediction is based on the geological record that shows when we have as much carbon in the air as we do today, which is 415 parts per million, 65 to 85 feet of sea level rise has occurred routinely in the past. And there's no reason to think that geological history will not repeat itself. So during the lives of our children and grandchildren, they will find themselves every day waiting in their boots down their urban streets and thinking about abandonment. And it's very sad to see that our major cities probably will be all too soon going under the sea. So I'll be more positive at the end, but I wanted to scare everybody badly right from the start.
Thank you, Richard. He says that knowing I'm from Key West, Florida. He's living up and so my town and home is definitely going underwater. So it's a poignant reminder of the realities out there. So Professor Crookall, your comments, sir.
Well, Richard said a lot of things that have been in my mind, so I don't want to repeat them. I do want to say, add in an element which I think we tend to forget. I've been influenced by my friendship with Dennis Meadows, and the last time I had lunch with him, he said to me, the world is no longer sustainable. And I think we're both optimistic as individuals, but for the planet, I think it's something else. And I feel, frankly, fairly pessimistic. I mean, Dennis brought out his report 40 years ago, something like that, and it's been validated. Much more recently, people, Stefan and Rostrom, have talked about planetary boundaries. There have been several warnings by the Union of Concerned Scientists, Nobel Prize winners signing declarations, people bringing out scientific studies, incredibly well done. But this hasn't seemed to have had any impact on decision making at the higher levels. Fairly recently, maybe one can detect a sort of growing awareness, especially in the younger people and in people who have the charge of managing towns. They're beginning to try and make their towns more climate friendly. But the big problem is that the climate is a huge, massive system. It has huge inertia, and it doesn't just stop the minute we stop putting CO2 into the air. And so even if we stop today putting CO2, climate change is going to continue for several decades. So I think the planet is, or humanity is facing some major, major difficulties. Even if we have solutions, the climate's going to continue to change. And the curve back down to the 1.5 of the Paris Agreement is going to be very, very difficult. I think that this growing awareness is important. There's various organizations doing this, 350.org. Then the, what's it called, the Extinction Rebellion, and a whole lot of other people, including Tim's new girlfriend. So, you know, there is hope. But I think there's one thing that we tend to sort of put on one side and that we should build into anything that we're going to do is learning. We tend to forget learning. And the thing is, everything we do in life, we learn. We talk about the 3 pillars of sustainable development. I think there should be 4. The 4th pillar is learning. And as a society, we learn. As individuals, we learn. And we pass that learning on to new generations. And so, unless we pay real attention to how do we get people and others to learn, I think it's going to be an uphill struggle. So maybe that's enough for the moment.
Well, that's excellent. I think sometimes we practice, because you led into exactly the things that I wanted to talk about, which is the learning. And my question is, who needs to learn in a new normal? A phrase that we've heard from some people is that everybody wants to get back to the normal. Is that true? If so, for who? Because Dennis Meadows, like me, David Crookall, and others, I knew we were not on a sustainable path. I delivered the report card to the 192 nations at the World Summit of Sustainable Development, the Global Environmental Outlook, in 2002. And there were 2 Ds and the rest were Fs on that report card. And climate change wasn't one of the measures. So we've gone precipitously down ever since. And that's alarming to me, but I don't want to be paralyzed by negative feelings. I want to think about positive. So from the previous normal, business as usual, which the initials are BAU, bah humbug, it was slowly killing the planet. Atmospheric pollution, loss of biodiversity, rapacious resource extraction, ocean and land spoiling. So again, and having been a scientist responsible for that in the UN and reporting on this is very, very tough things to do. But I know none of us can do this alone, and we need collaboration. We need multiple disciplines to learn and train our new selves, and that includes the indigenous knowledge. We need intergenerational cohorts learning and working together. So the old and the young need to go, and I like that theme I've been hearing about youth. This is what we need to do. So the good old days, the normal, I'm not really a supporter of that. Steven Pinker had wrote a book called Enlighten Now, and there are some positive things. There was internet, penicillin, you know, everybody has their favorite good things, but there was too much of the other. And today we need science versus emotions. We need to use the concept of tribal thinking should be a positive one with tribal instincts and characteristics for sustainability, not tribalism as though left or right political. So there's a lot of good things to come out of it, and I'd like to think about from the panel, we'll walk through and talk about what are the positive and negatives of the human relationship with planet Earth during this COVID-19? What changes are we seeing in the lockdown period? What are you experiencing from you know, in your own experience, and share with the rest of us? And so I'll start off. James Rattling Leaf, would you please start?
Okay. Also, thank you again, Tim. I guess on the negative side, let's start with the negative side. I think, you know, what I've seen or what I've heard from our tribal communities here in America is that the COVID-19 has really, again, demonstrated our vulnerability and our exposure, and also the inequities of the digital divide. It exacerbates, again, the need in the Indian country, to use that word. You know, you have families who don't have running water, and yet one of the strategies for dealing with COVID-19 is to wash your hands for 20 seconds. I don't know how you explain that to a family that doesn't have any drinking water and have been living that way for a long time. I think, again, COVID-19 has exposed the healthcare system for American Indian people. There's disparity there. And for many years, our tribal leaders have advocated the best they can to our federal government to say, you know, we need more funding to take care of our people. The other part of this, I think part of this discussion is, again, focused on the youth. I've committed myself, maybe the bulk of the rest of my career, if you want to say it that way, is to really think about how I can work and advocate and empower young people. Because I think as young people, as educators, I think as young people as entrepreneurs, and I'll finally say, I think young people as translators, meaning that, you know, they are mobilizing in their communities to do things, to take action, and not be sort of bogged down by the past experience of bureaucracies, and knowing that that's a reality that we face as tribal people. You know, we do have a unique federal, you know, relationship with the federal government here. You know, we have something called treaties, and so our leaders for many years have advocated for the just implementation, the just funding for our treaties, and in our treaties, healthcare and education are one of the big three in that. And so, how do we close that gap between the need and what's there? I think those are tremendous challenges. And Tim, you mentioned the role of traditional knowledge. Where does that fit into the equation? Is as we look at today and going forward. Well, I think that COVID has also impacted, you know, how we function as a tribal society. A lot of our families obviously are family centric, or we're bigger than just a nuclear family. Our aunts, our uncles, our grandmas, grandpas, our cousins are all part of what we call a tioshpe. And because we cannot interact like we did before, obviously there's an impact there. And I think as we think about these things as tribal people, it is a great challenge, and it brings back a memory, a social memory from the past when we were introduced to these kind of pandemics in our history. And I think sometimes, you know, it's a tough history for a lot of people, not only those who experience it like ourselves, but those who aren't aware of it. And so a lot of our role is to tell that story about what happened to us as Indian people, not only just to relive it or to, you know, to cast blame, but I think part of the strategy going forward is developing a context for understanding. We need to understand what happened to us in the past. We need to know what's happening today with those two things, and I think we can chart a way forward. So I agree that we need to think about, you know, these new relationships. I think we need to think about the role of spirituality in this work. Not so much we're trying to make everybody like us, but I think those things that that are impacted by COVID in terms of access to places and access to our ceremonies, access to those plants and flora and fauna that we use to sustain ourselves, you know, we need to look deeply at that. Finally, I'll just say this. The Indigenous people have had a responsibility for the renewal of the earth, not just our own tribal lands, our reservations today, but the earth. And so that's our responsibility. And so we continue to do that despite the COVID, despite all these disparities and inequities, and we'll continue to do that. So thank you.
Well, thank you, James. Very positive, strong statement. I thought when you mentioned about the bad and the water on the tribal lands, it reminds me that when the tide goes out, you'll find out who's been skinny dipping. The problems will show up. I do hope that we can leapfrog, and that the youth, the positive statements you were making about the youth, to help leapfrog so we don't have to do the dumb, inefficient, negative ways of the past. So, Melanie, would you like to share with us your thoughts, please, ma'am?
Thank you so much, James. I would echo that as far as the negatives, like when I'm talking to colleagues in India and, you know, the shortages, that to look at the really broad patterns of what has been going on in the world, you know, just like the healthcare system being broken, our political system being broken, COVID is, you know, it's a negative and a positive, because it is revealing, it's shining, you know, the light into those cracks, through those cracks, and giving us an opportunity. So we're seeing a lot of the negativity and the tragedy. It's giving people to go into what I do see is really occurring, and there's good and bad of it, is the digitalization. There's this possibility of bridging the digital divide as nations and school systems are forced to get online. And if there's enough of that learning shift that can happen, then perhaps we could all be in more of a cohesive global human family conversation about, and kind of get beyond some of the negative tribal divides that are keeping us from really, like, oh wow, this is going on there, this is going on here. It's us becoming connected as human beings. And like I mentioned earlier, if we could increase our empathy for each other. The other thing that's going on is there's more flexibility in work. So in some ways, we just had a Feminomics webinar earlier tonight with some leaders from Switzerland, from a woman working in Liberia, or from Sweden, from Japan, from Mexico, and looking at the different things we have in common. And there's a lot more flexibility for mothers and families and workplaces to allow their employees to work at home. So I'm feeling like, in a way, there's more ownership of how we're managing our time and how we can be more at choice. And even the way we're managing businesses, people would need to, like, empower their employees to kind of set goals. So there's so many transitions happening right now. And yeah, and the earth, I think, is coming alive as a living being. I think it's trying to heal itself, and it's like, wow, all that noise is out of the way. So I feel like all the species in the biodiversity that is still alive there is kind of talking to each other and resonating. So a lot going on.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Melanie. There's some positive thoughts there. I happen to live in a state park, and watching nature embrace me renews my spirit every day, and I feel very, very fortunate on that. I like the idea of the new working models, which empowers women, which is one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Because 6 months ago, my wife requested telecommuting, and they said, of course not. It's a policy in the company she works for. No way, couldn't happen. Guess what? She's telecommuting. So the world, it's going to be an interesting conversation after the pandemic to have them explain how that's not possible anymore. So the impossible is possible, and we're seeing it. That gives me hope, and we just need to raise the clarion call on that one. So, Richard Emory, sir, your comments, please.
Well, thank you. During this COVID lockdown period, we've seen what happens when our national government fails to plan and manage the war against a global killer. And of course, the next global killer will be climate change. And at the same time, we've had 4 months to sit at home and think. And while the virus means we can't roam around using the subway or metro, some of us realize that in a few decades, the underground transport will be permanently flooded anyway. We've already seen the ocean flood the New York underground when Superstorm Sandy hit New York in 2012. So it's going to be an unrecognizable new world, particularly for the big cities. At the same time, we've seen the air and water clarify globally. We have a vision now of what the world used to look like and could look like again when it was clean and green. And some of us hope that we can rediscover the passion that brought about the first Earth Day in 1970 and the flood of 1970s legislation that created and empowered the biggest and best, not today, but it was then the biggest and best EPA in the world. And we've seen the Greta Thunbergs and many of our smart grandchildren marching in the streets to protest with the carelessness of their grandparents. And these children realize that their grandparents have to tune in and start helping. And let's hope we do. It's possible that some of us supposedly mature people are starting to realize that now, it's 40 years too late because of our bungling, we must start to plan for the future if we have a future, and if our grandchildren and their grandchildren have a future. So that's what I've been thinking about during the COVID shutdown.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Richard. And I know you have grandchildren, and think about that. I was reminded though of the different models that exist out there. I mentioned that I live in the state park. I'm a live-in steward of the land here, a lifetime agreement. This is a unique Maryland organizational program, 50 of us. I own nothing. I can't sell this house that I live in, this beautiful home, but I'm responsible for maintaining it, and I restored it. So there's a lot of models that are out there where people don't have to own, but we can transfer for many generations. So this is the time to rethink those, think out of the box, as it were, because the box was killing us. So I'll let Professor David Crookall, please.
Okay. During the this period of lockdown, one thing that I noticed is that a lot of the pollution has sort of diminished a huge lot, or even disappeared, or largely. And from various reports, you can see that nature is returning. The bees are having a great time now. and there's less threat to their demise, their extinction, and they're so essential to life on Earth. But how long is that going to last? The reason why these things are springing back to life is that there's less pollution, and pollution is enormous killer, and it combines with the COVID-19 virus, and people who have lived in very polluted areas tend to die more than those who've not, because the pollution has a very negative impact on the immune system. And various people are saying, well, you know, this is great. Now we can stay like this and get down to reducing pollution and all that kind of thing, and CO2. The question I have is, what is this sudden disappearance of pollution, the particulate matter, going to do for climate change, global warming? And I've been sort of thinking, I haven't seen any papers about it, but I guess we will at some point, that the pollution up till now in various places around the planet over the industrial areas has a kind of masking effect. So it reduces the incoming energy from the sun. But now it's gone, there's much more energy can come in those places, but it's trapped by the greenhouse gases. The greenhouse gases haven't disappeared. They take several hundred years to disappear, especially CO2. So it could well be that this virus is actually having a little boost for global warming. Probably not very much. So that's the thing that I've noticed most during the lockdown. There's been a huge sense of solidarity, which is very encouraging. I think Melanie talked about that, and I hope that will continue later. Certainly among certain kinds of people, there's great solidarity. The recent conference of the European Geosciences Union was cancelled. We did it online and through this Zoom, and it worked very well. It may be that one positive thing to come out of this is that people become more aware of the fragility of the environment and of society. And therefore, they're more willing to actually do something to protect it. Now, I noticed that in the United States, the idea of social protection doesn't seem to be very prominent, but in France, you know, there's a lot of talk about social protection, and it tends to be implemented. Will people as individuals or as a society become more aware of death as a possibility? Extinction Rebellion is fairly strong on that. So maybe these are things that could be carried over. I don't know. We don't know what the future is going to be. But there are sort of hopeful signs.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, David, for that comment. And we've got a silent partner in there, David Wortley. Would you like to comment, David Wortley, on this same question, sir?
Yes, I would like to comment on this, because one of we've seen many things during the lockdown period, and some of these things have been quite positive. It's a little bit difficult for me because I'm in the lockdown and I'm in a rural location in beautiful countryside. And so in many ways, the quality of my life has improved. I do miss the travel, but I'm enjoying the countryside, and I'm able to devote more attention to things which, in retrospect, I think are going to be more positive and beneficial to the things that I believe in. But I have observed quite a number of different changes in behavior, which I think are pretty good signs, really. And it's probably an opportune point to share the cartoon that Tim sent to me earlier on today, because I think the message behind this cartoon is very appropriate and very timely. So if you can't see this this cartoon, there's the Pogo, Mother Goose and Grimm, and I don't get this Pogo. The virus has forced us cartoon characters to stay inside for 5 weeks. Now there's no pollution, no greenhouse effect, and our rivers and lakes are clean and clear. Yeah, we have met the enemy, and he is us. And I think there's quite a bit of truth in that. I think that the most positive thing to come out of COVID-19 is that we have a unique opportunity to change. We've been forced against our will to live in a lockdown and social isolation situation, and we've had to make the best of it. And this has brought out many positive characteristics of human behavior, a sense of community, a sense of humor, collective responsibility, and many different changes in behavior, which I can't help but feel, if they were able to be continued, would have a really important fact. And it may be that this is the last and only chance that we will have as the human race to be able to change direction. So the question is, as everybody else has mentioned, is whether we can continue these positive behaviors and try to develop a new normal way of life, which is much more sustainable and a much better legacy for our grandchildren. So that's my view on that. And just as an aside, it's an observation in the UK. Never before in my lifetime have we had daily bulletins from senior politicians and the Prime Minister with updates on the situation. And the thing that's extraordinary about a lot of those is that the politicians actually answer the questions. I'm so used to politicians avoiding answering the questions that it's quite refreshing to see politicians being on national television, being willing to be cross-examined by sometimes hostile media people and the general public, and they've stood there and they've taken everything that's been thrown at them, and they still continue to answer the questions. And I think if there's one thing that I would like to see, that would be a positive sign to continue, and maybe a signal for us to develop a new way of living, which is much more sustainable.
Well, thank you very much, David. I think we talk about flattening the curve. I think we need to flatten the hierarchy and put people at the top a little more on a peer-to-peer relation with all of us. And it was raised earlier about looking to government for leadership and what are the things that we need. And I was reminded of my old boss, Kofi Annan, who I had so much respect for, who promoted the concept of a type 2 partnership. Where industry, NGOs, academics, and government work together. So those 4 horsemen, if you will, would work together and collaborate, because we can't expect the solutions to come from government or academia or industry. And the NGOs, which represent the communities, much like Melanie's NGO, these kinds of organizations, collectively, that's the power needed. And so we're in a time of maybe renewing our understanding of the type 2 partnerships. The digital divide, which has been talked about, and thank you for keep chatting and questions. We really appreciate that from the participants. We are watching and monitoring that. Rebecca Moore, who worked with Google, was showing how the Amazonians were using satellites and geographic information systems to help protect their land and go to court. When I see people in loincloths using technology, I realize that sometimes we bandy about the digital divide, and we're really talking about an economic divide. And we're confusing the digitization potential with the economic realities. And I think if we get break into it and don't just put it in the same piles and go, you know, that Native Americans or African Americans don't have access. That's not true. So what we have to do is look at in the new models. I suggest that we don't just use it as an excuse, but begin to dig deeper into that. And I love the idea of the clean airs and the experiment, what I called the great global COVID experiment or sustainability experiment. Believe you me, the data from the Keeling laboratory in Mauna Loa up in Hawaii is collecting information, and we will find out very soon exactly what's happening with the atmosphere. So now we're going to switch to the third section with our panel and ask, what are the likely positives and negatives of the human relationship with planet Earth after COVID-19? See, we're on the other side. We're at the light at the end of the tunnel, the other side of Earth squeeze, as I say. Excuse me. Will there be a better world, or will we go back to the old normal? My apologies. If you were talking to children, what would you tell them about the coming months, years, and decades? Or if you were talking to adults, what would you tell them? So, James, would you like to begin that, sir?
Well, great question, Tim, and I think it sort of speaks to everything that I've listened to here today with you, and also the questions from people asking where do we go from here. And I think certainly from my perspective, Lakota culture, we have this understanding about 7 generations. We have this thing called prophecies, and these are sort of guideposts for us as we decide, as a tribe, as a community, what actions, what decisions we need to make today for the future of our people. And I sort of go back again to our understanding of the world. We come from an oral tradition where our knowledge and wisdom has come generations through storytelling and through things like winter counts. And our ancestors were very innovative people, very adaptable people, and there's a story for us there to remember and to really think deeply about how we may carry those things forward into the future, and how we bring in technology, how we bring in science. We know that, as you mentioned earlier, Tim, about your friends in Amazon using geospatial technology. I think we're not afraid to use technology. It's just the people who use the technology that we're concerned about, and how they do that ethically. I think there's an ethical dimension to this discussion that we need to raise here, and about injustice and about those things that you mentioned earlier about the digital divide. I got up this morning, got ready for this call, turned on my computer, and I was on the internet. Whereas our friend in Amazon, he had to get a cell phone. He had to travel to the internet. He had to go someplace to get onto the internet. And so there's still those kind of cultures out there in the world that still have that barrier to address. Whether they want to go forward, increase it, bring technology to the Amazon, for instance, but that's their decision if they want to do that. I think the other part is that going forward, if I tell children, I think the important part of that is that there is a community of young people out there that are working together. And I'll just promote a couple things here. I was asked to join something called the Group on Earth Observations meeting we had in Australia last fall. And out of that meeting came to something called the Geo-Indigenous Alliance. And so we met as Indigenous leaders, thought leaders, experts, if you will, in some of the technologies to talk about how do we best empower Indigenous communities around the world using geo data science and technology. So that work has started, and we would welcome partnerships. We would welcome friends and allies as we pursue this work, because that's what we're talking about, is the role of information and how that can support communities, and how we prepare young people. The other part I haven't heard yet in this discussion is the term economic development. How do we prepare jobs? How do you prepare a new generation to work and to provide for their families, to have access to resources so that they can take care of their families? Those are all important questions, I think, as we go forward. I think the role of geospatial technology as we been talking about today, you know, has a role in that. The skills necessary to utilize that, and also the entrepreneurship again, the skill sets using to do that. So so we're happy. I think we're here as Indigenous people. You know, we're working globally. We want to work, but we want to do these 4 things. I say respect, reverence, reciprocity, and responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, James, very much. I like the idea of you raising the issue of the economics, because new models need to be also envisioned. I can say that the barter system is employed and is gauged to be 40% or more in many, many regions of the world, as I say, or more. So it doesn't get taxed, it's not recognized, etc. So the models for person-to-person bartering, ways of doing it, if it needs to be looked at and see how that might empower people. And because obviously, if there's no bread on the table, it's not going to be a happy home, as we well know. All right, and so I'm looking over here. Is Melanie still aboard?
Yes.
Ah, excellent. Please.
So James, you just really laid it down. It's Indigenous values, and if we could take back the media and transform our learning, and teach each other and embrace Indigenous values, and like shape some new systems, policy systems. I'm curious what's happening with UN DRIP, and the structures that are keeping things going downhill. They're not going to fix themselves, right? So at the end of the day, what are the trim tabs, the rudders, the real pinpoints? How can we bring those Indigenous voices into the greater media and democratize power in a way that's going to put the stakeholders that are most affected by the critical decisions at the table? So I think it's so beautiful and refreshing to hear you stating some key values of reciprocity and respect, and that's where, as a movement moving forward, it's also a question of like, well, how is this new AI, machine learning, how can we promote appropriate technologies that are inclusive? How do we make policies that are driving technology not just be based on male archetypes and thinking, right? So but really shape the technology, shape the modern agenda with values in the lead. I think, I just love to really hold on to that in our design, in our solutions. And I also wanted to touch on the Kofi Annan's bringing these different sectors in. I feel like there's some new organisms that really need to come into play. And, the work of Barbara Marx Hubbard, she passed a year ago, but she was, looking at this new humanity. There's a lot of our, also another woman, earth leader, earth lawyer, Polly Higgins, passed last year. She was part of 2012, David Wortley, with the Global Summit there. And, there's this great work that's been done, and it's at the precipice. How can we honor those that have come before us, and also, support the stakeholders of the future, the Indigenous people and the youth, and putting them at the table with these values. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Melanie. And the role of women is improving. We're getting more women in this country. So it's, while it takes time, and some of us aren't very patient, we are seeing some indications. And so far, every time a woman takes leadership, whether it's the IMF or running the House of the Congressional House of Representatives, we see tremendous improvement in the direction. So bring on the women. I can't wait, myself personally. The one thing you talked about in the decisions, or the technology, it's a term I've used for a long time, is the spatial technologies I use are for visualizations for community decision support. The community has to make the decisions. And unless they see it in the aggregate, which is why Digital Earth, Global Earth, Google Earth, these things, these tools, let people see where they live and see what the challenges are, and let them make collective decisions, rather than, as with the oil pipelines, corporations, nameless corporations, are deciding the fate of pollution and threats to the environment. No, we need to get the communities being in charge of the lands, and that's indigenous knowledge, that's indigenous philosophy. So I agree with you. We need to go back and learn again. Okay, Richard, your comments, sir.
Well, I just want to say, like you already did, I think that women rule the hearth and the home, and I think it's time for them to rule the world, because the men have certainly made a mess of it. And so bring on the women. Well, I started being very negative, and I want to finish by being positive. I have 3 quick points. And the first point is that even if much of my generation and leaders in power today continue bundling on with business as usual, I do think, as a final last-ditch defense, there's a positive and some good news, which is that the devastating flooding destroying our national capitals and our major seaports and our vast urban areas, probably starting at the end of this century and maybe the middle of this century, is good news. Now, why do I say that? Because it will certainly wake up our grandchildren in time for them to say, we hope, in time for them to save their grandchildren. I think it'll be a close call, it'll be a squeaker, but if they just end all pollution of the atmosphere causing climate change, which they can do, we can do, we will be able to prevent human extinction. I started talking about that, but I'm telling you now, I don't think it's necessarily going to happen. I think it probably will not happen, no matter how much my generation and present leaders continue to bungle. All right, what can we do today to stop bungling? And there are 2 things I want to say. Point number 2 is that really good news is that business as usual can quickly be replaced with climate-friendly methods, tools, and technologies, because we have all the tools, the technology, we can deploy them, and we are deploying them. We're just not doing it fast enough. So with the real uptick in policies that can bring on these technologies more quickly, we can stop killing the climate with chemicals and really go green. So the third and last takeaway, the best news of all for me, is something from personal experience I know something about, is that in addition to having all the technologies right in our hands right now, the history of the United States Environmental Protection Agency has demonstrated that when government is restored, hopefully, and good government will be restored hopefully in 2021, that we have all the proven policies and the legal authorities that come from good policies to stop climate-killing air pollution starting next January. And this is something that in my life's work and with authenticity I can tell you about, because I was a part of the EPA when it was the biggest and the best in the world. Let's recall that, and there are many things I could tell you about that EPA did, but I'm just going to mention the air pollution ones because we're running out of time, and that's what's most relevant to climate change. So using cap and trade, we took the lead out of gasoline in the 1980s. It was causing brain-damaged babies in urban areas. In the 1990s, again, using cap and trade, we stopped the acid rain from power plants that was causing forest death and poisoning the lakes in northern temperate regions. Climate change is just, to me, another air pollution problem. Like, what's another air pollution problem that can be quickly solved if we have the power and the authority? I do think cap and trade may not be the right mechanism. It would have been if we hadn't squandered 40 years, but I think we're going to have to go to a carbon tax, or better yet, a carbon fee and rebate, which is revenue neutral, And I think that's probably the policy of choice. And a lot of conservatives in America, very fine people agree, who are conservative leaders, agree with that. So I'm quite hopeful. And I just mention one more thing. We haven't really talked internationally. You know, I worked internationally for 17 years, and maybe we ought to have another webinar because this problem cannot be solved by the United States, although we ought to start leading the way. But there are a lot of international aspects to this that we could talk about some more that will inform us going forward and will be absolutely essential because the whole world has to get together if we're going to do this.
Thank you very much, Richard. I know for those that buy your book, and I hope they do, they'll find that you lived in Europe and learned a lot about, while America, United States had some things to offer, you learned so much from the Europeans on a better way of living, that they're, etc. So as I say, there's 7.6 billion people out there. There's a lot of sources of smartness. And so you talked about the potential of the government's role and how powerful it can be, in combination with the human behavior shifts. And I believe that in this post-COVID world, we're going to find out that we didn't need to drive so often, that we only need to shop once every week or so, instead of gas guzzling SUVs crowding up the highway. So there's things that we can shift in our behavior that I think are positive lessons learned. Professor Crookall, please share with us your thoughts.
We don't know what the future is going to be. It depends so much on us, whatever us is. And you mentioned the elections coming up. Again, I think a certain amount depends on that. I think that the idea of going back to the old normal, I think is a strange idea in a certain sense, because it's like assuming that what was happening up until the virus was normal. I consider that it was certainly not normal. And it was certainly not normal, at least in many people's minds, that maybe something like 90% of the riches of the earth are held by 10% of the population. The people who are starving, refugees in massive refugee camps. There are outbreaks of COVID-19 in refugee camps. And all this sort of what you might call Brave New World almost, is it going to pass by these people? I think that any idea of the future has to build in much more resilience. How resilience is defined is a big question, but it has to, in my view, take into account the poor, the starving, the refugees, because with the world on two speeds, with the rich and the poor, it's just not going to work. It doesn't work within countries, it doesn't work within communities, it's not going to work across the globe. And the problem is that the gap between the rich and the poor is not getting less, it's getting more. It's increasing. All you need to do is look at a recent Oxfam report, or recent, a year or two ago. And I think that what happens in the future, it depends a lot on how people vote for the people who are going to represent them. And how people vote depends on their education. And so at the sort of the pedestal of everything that we're hoping to build is education. And if people don't, if nations and groups and so on don't have a good educational system and methods for learning, then a lot is going to go to waste. And we're not going to achieve these sustainable development goals. There's a lot of, quite a number of reports that saying that we're really a long, long way from achieving them. So I think that it's impossible now to say what kind of future we're going to have. I think it depends a lot on how each individual works and how they work as groups and how they work as communities and how they work as communities across the globe. And it's very nice, all these United Nations organizations, IPCC, and the climate change people with whom I've worked a little bit. But they're the privileged on this planet. And I think that we can't really ethically think about the future unless we take these underprivileged people into account. I think they really have to be brought on board. And I think organizations like Oxfam and many others are good ones to include in the ways we think about things. So building a more resilient future. I remember my friend Dennis Meadows, to whom I go back to the last time I talked with him, he said, the world is not sustainable anymore. And what we need to do is each of us in ourselves and in our small communities build what he called pockets of resilience. Will those pockets of resilience stretch out to the hundreds of thousands of refugees in camps, to poor people, starving children, children who are exploited for mining rare metals for our benefit, in our telephones? Things like that are still going to continue, and they have to be taken on board, I think. So any kind of grand scheme of bringing down CO2 is fantastic, but we have to address some of these fundamental inequalities.
Well, thank you very much, David. I really appreciate your reminding us to consider the lesser of our brothers and sisters in this equation. And having lived near the slums in Nairobi and walking past abject poverty and remembering the smell of dead bodies after the tsunami, these are things that never leave me. So I really appreciate your helping remind us of the focus as we go. And again, I'm so appreciative of all the panelists and of David Wortley putting this thing on, because if this is a special time and we have a chance, then we can't sit by and say, oh, gee, let's wait to see what I read in the newspaper. We have to be doing things. And I think each one of these panelists are doers. And from the voices in the chat, the Zoom chat room, there's a lot of champions out there. And I hope this embrace has allowed people to embrace each other and recognize that it's reach out and connect. And that's very, very positive. So I will turn this back over to Dave Wortley, and thank you all for the privilege and honor of being able to participate with you today.
Thank you very much, Tim, and a really big thank you to all the panelists and especially to all our participants. We've had participants from all over the world. We've had some excellent comments in the chat section, and we've had some really good questions. Now, we are 25 minutes over the end time, so I think it's going to be pretty impractical with the number of people who've already left to handle the Q&A. But what I will say is that all of your questions are being stored, and all of your questions will be dealt with after the event. My plan is to collate all of the questions and share those with both the panelists and also all of the participants. So everyone will be able to see what questions have been had in an email from me in the next couple of days, and we'll be able to provide their own answer and comments to those questions. So we'll try and share it in the form of email or a blog. The other thing that I want to mention at this time is that this webinar is part of a series of webinars on a number of different important topics which really affect our future. So what I'm going to do now is share on the screen with you just some of the events that are coming up and invite you to participate in those events. Now, as well as organizing these webinars of my own, I'm also running another webinar on Thursday for IORMA Global Commerce, and that's going to be on the subject of Africa. On Friday, and this is the session that I really want to draw your attention to, because it is an opportunity for you, again, to meet those of panelists that we've had today who are available on Friday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon British summer time for what we call a new normal networking session. And the objective of this is to bring together people in a much more intimate setting, in small groups, so that you can video chat with other people, you can share your ideas and opinions, you can make new connections and contacts that will be enduring after this event. And I've noticed from the chat sessions today that we have quite a bit of networking going on, so lots of new connections, and this is all very positive from my perspective if we are going to make some positive changes for the future. Next Tuesday, a week from now, we'll be running another webinar on digital heritage, active aging, and healthy community development. In my mind, these are all topics which very much relate to the future after COVID-19. And there are some great opportunities, I think, by tapping into these concepts to make a positive difference for the future. So every Friday, we're going to be having what I call the new normal networking sessions, and as well as being able to meet panelists from this week and panelists from next week, the idea is that you will get an opportunity to meet some of the extraordinary people that have been on panels today and will be on our panels in the future. And together, we have an opportunity to build a better world. There is a URL shown on the screen there, but you will also get reminded of that URL when this webinar today is finished. I'm very fortunate to count amongst my friends the panelists that we've seen today. They're all extraordinary people, and I'm very grateful to them for giving their time. I'm also sorry that I've not had time to involve some of our participants. We have had some excellent people registered for this event, some of them very good friends of mine. Alessandro Anoni, he's the president of the International Symposium for Digital Earth. He's been involved in this event along with Changlin Wang, who's in the Secretariat for ISDE. One of my other very good friends from Nepal, a guy called Lashe Bahadur, he's a secondary school head teacher in Nepal, and he's seen some terrible deprivation, but the resilience of those people has been absolutely remarkable. Thank you once again to everyone for taking part in this session, for all your comments and all your interactivity. It only remains for me to say thank you once again. And this webinar has been recorded, or at least the bulk of it has been recorded. There was a small section at the beginning that wasn't recorded, but what we have recorded will be shared with all the panelists, so you'll be able to not only see the recording, but also hopefully share that with other people. So now I'm going to bring this session to a close and say thank you to everyone, and hope to see you at future webinars.